Have you ever looked at someone and thought, they seem so normal, so charming, even perfect? That's what everyone thought about Ted Bundy. He was handsome, intelligent, studying to be a lawyer, and he had this charisma that could disarm anyone. But behind that polished exterior lurked a monster. A monster who would become one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. This is the story of how a man who seemed to have it all became a symbol of pure evil. To understand the horror of Ted Bundy, we have to go back to the beginning. Born in 1946, his early life was shrouded in secrets and lies. He grew up believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents. This family secret was just the first layer of deception in a life that would be defined by it. As a young man, he was described as shy and awkward, often on the fringes of social circles. But he was also exceptionally bright. He went to college, studied psychology, and even worked on a political campaign for a Washington governor. People who knew him then saw a promising young man with a bright future. They saw someone who was going places, someone they could trust, and that trust was his most dangerous weapon. The 1970s, it was a time of change, freedom, and for many young women across America, a time of unprecedented fear. The nightmare began in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. Young women started disappearing. One by one, they vanished without a trace. These weren't women in high-risk situations. They were college students, bright and full of life, disappearing from their dorms, from parks, from public places in broad daylight. The police were baffled. The cases seemed unrelated at first, spread across different jurisdictions. There were few witnesses and even fewer clues. The only common thread was the victims. Young, attractive women with long, dark hair, often parted in the middle. A pattern began to emerge, a terrifying method to the madness. Witnesses started coming forward with a strange but consistent story. They described a handsome, charming man, often with his arm in a sling or on crutches. He would approach young women, asking for help with something simple. Carrying books to his car, loading a sailboat onto a trailer, he played on their kindness, their willingness to help someone who appeared injured and harmless. This man was, of course, Ted Bundy. The cast, the sling, it was all a ruse. A calculated performance designed to lure his victims into a trap. Once they were isolated, the charming facade would drop, and the monster would be revealed. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, using his looks and intelligence as camouflage. One of the most chilling examples of his brazenness happened at Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington in July 1974. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and the park was crowded with people. Bundy, using his fake injury ploy, approached multiple women, asking for help with his sailboat. Many politely declined. But two women, Janice, OTT, and Denise Nasland, weren't so lucky. They disappeared from the crowded park, just hours apart. Thousands of people were there, yet he managed to abduct two women in broad daylight. This event sent a shockwave of terror through the community. The monster wasn't just lurking in the dark alleys. He was walking among them, smiling, at a public beach on a Sunday afternoon. As the disappearances mounted in Washington and Oregon, Bundy was getting ready to make a move. He had been accepted into law school at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And when he moved, the terror moved with him. Suddenly, the string of unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest stopped, and a new wave of horror began in Utah. Then Colorado, the pattern was identical. Young women vanishing. The police in different states were still working in silos, not yet connecting the dots. They were all hunting for their own local bogeyman, not realizing they were all chasing the same ghost. A ghost who was now driving his Volkswagen Beetle across state lines, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. But Bundy was getting cocky. He was making mistakes. In August 1975, a Utah highway patrolman spotted Bundy's VW Beetle cruising a residential neighborhood late at night. When the officer pulled him over, he discovered a ski mask, rope, handcuffs, and other suspicious items in the car. Bundy was arrested for possession of burglary tools. It seemed like a minor charge, but it was the first thread that would begin to unravel his web of lies. More importantly, it put him on the police radar. A young woman named Carol DeRonch, who had survived an abduction attempt in Utah months earlier, was shown his picture. She identified him as the man who had posed as a police officer and tried to kidnap her. The mask was slipping. The charming law student was now a prime suspect. Bundy was convicted of the kidnapping of Carol DeRonch and sentenced to prison in Utah. For a moment, it seemed like the nightmare was over. But Ted Bundy wasn't an ordinary criminal. He was a master manipulator, and he had no intention of staying behind bars. While in custody, he was also charged with a murder in Colorado. During a pre-trial hearing at the courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, Bundy saw his chance. He was acting as his own attorney, which gave him access to the law library, which wasn't behind bars. During a recess, he simply walked over to a window, opened it, and jumped out. He leaped from the second floor, injuring his ankle, but he was free. The manhunt was on, but Bundy managed to evade capture for 6 days, hiding in the mountains before being caught. You'd think, after one escape, security would be airtight. You would be wrong. Just a few months later, back in a Colorado jail, Bundy pulled off an even more daring and elaborate escape. Over weeks, he had been slowly chipping away at the ceiling of his cell. On December 30th, 1977, he squeezed through the hole, crawled through the ceiling, and dropped into an empty apartment in the jailer's residence. He changed into civilian clothes he had stolen and walked out the front door to freedom. He was gone. And this time, he was headed for Florida. This escape would lead to his most infamous and brutal crime spree. He arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, in January 1978, using a fake name and renting a room near the Florida State University campus. On the night of January 15th, he unleashed hell. He broke into the Chi Omega sorority house. In a frenzied attack lasting no more than 15 minutes, he brutally assaulted 4 young women as they slept, killing 2 of them, Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. The crime scene was one of unimaginable horror. Just hours later, he broke into another nearby apartment and attacked another student, leaving her for dead. A few weeks later, his final victim was a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach, whom he abducted from her middle school. This final, brutal spree was the end of the road. On February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, ran a check on a suspicious car and discovered it was stolen. The driver was Ted Bundy. When they arrested him, he was defiant, but the evidence was overwhelming. The most crucial piece of evidence came from the Chi Omega crime scene. A unique bite mark left on one of the victims, Lisa Levy, was a perfect match to Bundy's teeth. In a trial that captivated the nation, forensic odontology, the study of bite marks, was used for the first time in a major case. It sealed his fate. The charming facade was gone, replaced by a snarling, arrogant man who continued to proclaim his innocence, even as the mountain of evidence buried him. Bundy was sentenced to death. He spent years on death row, playing games with investigators, media, and psychologists. He would hint at the true number of his victims, offering to confess in exchange for stays of execution. He confessed to around 30 murders across 7 states, but investigators believe the true number is much, much higher. He was a chameleon, a void, a man completely lacking empathy. In his final interviews, just before his execution, He tried to blame his actions on pornography and a sick society. He never took true responsibility. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, cheering. It was a strange, cathartic end to a story that had held the nation in a grip of terror for over a decade. The story of Ted Bundy is more than just a true crime tale. It's a cautionary story. It reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it wears a handsome one. It's charming, intelligent, and persuasive. Bundy shattered the illusion that monsters look like monsters. He looked like a friend, a neighbor, a helpful stranger. His legacy is the chilling realization that the person you trust the most could be harboring the darkest secrets. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question: how well do we really know the people around us? He was a family man, a church leader, a Boy Scout troop leader, and a compliance officer. To his community in Wichita, Kansas, Dennis Rader was just another ordinary, somewhat unremarkable neighbor. But for 30 long years, this seemingly normal man harbored a monstrous secret. He was the city's most feared predator, the self-proclaimed BTK killer. The story begins on January 15, 1974. The Otero family, Joseph, Julie, and two of their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were found brutally murdered in their home. The crime scene was horrific, and it marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would grip Wichita for decades. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and very little evidence. He was a ghost. Shortly after the Otero murders, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper, tucked inside a book in the public library. The letter was from the killer himself. He described the murders in chilling detail, details only the perpetrator could know. And he gave himself a name that would become synonymous with fear, BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. This was his signature, his method. The BTK killer taunted the police and the media for years. He sent cryptic letters, poems, and even puzzles. He craved recognition. He wanted the world to know about his work. He would describe his crimes with a disturbing sense of pride and detachment, referring to his victims as projects. The community was terrified. People locked their doors, looked at their neighbors with suspicion, and lived in constant fear of who might be next. The BTK task force was formed, and detectives worked tirelessly, but the killer remained elusive. Between 1974 and 1991, BTK claimed 10 victims. His attacks were sporadic, with years of silence in between. He would stalk his victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, their habits, their lives. He called this trolling. He would then break into their homes, often in broad daylight, and wait. The psychological terror he inflicted was as much a part of his method as the physical violence. He wanted control, absolute power over his victims in their final moments. The victims came from all walks of life. Catherine Bright, a young college student in 1974. Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox in 1977. Maureen Hedge in 1985. A neighbor who lived just down the street from Rader. Vicky Wegerell in 1986. And Dolores Davis in 1991. Each murder was a chilling reminder that the monster was still out there, hiding in plain sight. After the murder of Dolores Davis, BTK went silent. The letters stopped. The killings stopped. For over a decade, it seemed the nightmare was finally over. The case went cold, a dark chapter in Wichita's history that many thought would never find its conclusion. Then, in 2004, the silence was broken. A letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle, 30 years after the first one. It contained a copy of Vicky Weggle's driver's license and photos from her murder scene. BTK was back. Why now? It seems the media's renewed interest in the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders had reawakened his ego. He couldn't stand being forgotten. This time, however, the world was different. Technology had advanced in ways Rader couldn't have imagined. His desire for attention, the very thing that drove him, would become his undoing. He continued his cat-and-mouse game with the police, sending more packages and letters. He sent a package containing a cereal box with a doll bound inside, symbolizing his crimes. He left clues and items at various locations, reveling in the media storm he was creating. The breakthrough came from a question Rader himself posed to the police. In one of his communications, he asked if he could send them information on a floppy disk without being traced. The police, seizing the opportunity, responded through a classified ad in the newspaper, saying it would be safe. It was a calculated risk, a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. Rader took the bait. He sent a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk to a local news station. On that disk, investigators found more than just a taunting message. They discovered hidden metadata in a deleted Microsoft Word document. The metadata contained the words Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis. The net was closing in. Police quickly connected the dots. Dennis Rader was the president of the Congregation Council at Christ Lutheran Church. His background was checked, and the pieces started to fit. He was a compliance officer, which gave him a guise of authority and a reason to be in people's neighborhoods. He lived a seemingly normal life with his wife and 2 children. But the final, irrefutable proof was yet to come. Investigators obtained a warrant to test the DNA of Rader's daughter from a pap smear she had taken at a university medical clinic. The DNA was a familial match to the DNA found under the fingernails of Vicky Wegerle back in 1986. They had him on February 25, 2005. Dennis Rader was pulled over on his way home from work. As the police cruisers surrounded him, the 30-year reign of terror came to a quiet, almost anticlimactic end. In custody, Rader confessed to everything. He spoke about the murders for over 30 hours, with no remorse. Describing his victims and his projects in a chillingly calm and detailed manner, he explained that his motivation was a desire for fame and power, driven by dark fantasies he'd had since childhood. The man who terrorized a city for 3 decades was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of his victims. He is currently serving his sentence at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. The case of the BTK killer is a terrifying reminder that monsters aren't always strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they are the people we know, the people next door. The story of Dennis Rader serves as a chilling lesson in the duality of human nature and the dark secrets that can lie beneath the most ordinary of facades. Have you ever heard of a story so bizarre, so filled with twists and turns, that it sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie? Well, today, we're diving into a real-life tale that's even stranger than fiction. This is the chilling story of Robert Durst, the eccentric real estate heir whose life was a tangled web of wealth, disappearances, and murder. Born into one of New York's wealthiest real estate dynasties, Robert Durst seemed to have it all. But behind the facade of privilege, a dark and troubled history was brewing. Our story begins in 1982. Robert's wife, Kathy McCormack Durst, a bright and beautiful medical student, suddenly vanishes. One day, she's there. The next, she's gone without a trace. Robert told police they had an argument, and he put her on a train to New York City. He claimed he spoke to her on the phone later that night. But that was the last time anyone supposedly heard from her. Days turned into weeks. weeks into years. Kathy was never seen again. No body, no crime scene, no definitive proof of what happened. For nearly 2 decades, the case went cold. Robert Durst moved on with his life, managing family properties and living under a cloud of suspicion that never quite went away. He was the prime suspect, but without evidence, police couldn't make a move. Kathy's family and friends never gave up hope for justice, but the mystery of her disappearance remained unsolved. Fast forward to the year 2000. The investigation into Kathy's disappearance is suddenly reopened. Police are getting ready to interview a key person, Susan Berman. Susan was a successful writer and, more importantly, Robert Durst's closest friend and confidant. She had been his unofficial spokesperson after Kathy vanished, fielding calls from the media and defending him fiercely. Many believe she knew more about Kathy's disappearance than she ever let on. Right before she was scheduled to talk to the police, something horrifying happened. Susan Berman was found dead in her Beverly Hills home. She had been shot, execution style, in the back of the head. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting she knew her killer. The timing was more than suspicious. It was downright alarming. Coincidence? Many investigators didn't think so. The prime suspect in this new, brutal murder, you guessed it, Robert Durst. Once again, the heat was on Durst. But proving his involvement was another difficult challenge. The evidence was circumstantial. So, what does a multimillionaire do when he's the center of 2 murder investigations? He runs. Robert Durst went into hiding, but not in the way you might expect. He didn't flee to a private island. Instead, he disguised himself as a mute woman and rented a cheap apartment in Galveston, Texas. Yes, you heard that right. A millionaire real estate heir living as a mute woman in a rundown boarding house. This is where the story takes another dark and unbelievable turn. While living in Galveston, Durst became friends with his neighbor, an elderly man named Morris Black. In September 2001, parts of Morris Black's dismembered body were found floating in Galveston Bay. The police traced the gruesome discovery back to the apartment building and, eventually, to Robert Durst. He was arrested for the murder of Morris Black. This time, it seemed like Durst was finally cornered. They had a body, they had a suspect, and they had a mountain of bizarre circumstances. The trial that followed was a media circus. The prosecution argued that Maurice Black had discovered Durst's true identity, and Durst killed him to maintain his cover. Durst's SI-powered legal team came up with a defense that was just as shocking as the crime itself. Durst admitted to dismembering Morris Black's body. He admitted to throwing the pieces into the bay, but he claimed he didn't murder him. His story was that he and Black were struggling over a gun, and it went off accidentally, killing Black instantly. Durst said he panicked, thinking no one would believe it was an accident, especially given his past. So, he decided to chop up the body and dispose of it. The jury was faced with a difficult decision. Could they believe this wild story of self-defense from a man who had lied and run for years? In a stunning verdict that shocked the nation, the jury acquitted Robert Durst of murder. They bought the self-defense argument. He was found guilty of dismemberment and jumping bail. But for the murder of Morris Black, he walked free. For the 3rd time, Robert Durst, a man connected to a disappearance, a murder, and a dismemberment, had seemingly slipped through the grasp of justice. It was a legal outcome that left many people speechless and horrified. For years, it seemed like that might be the end of the story. Durst was a free man, albeit a notorious one. The cases of Kathy Durst and Susan Berman remained officially unsolved, their families still searching for answers. But the story wasn't over. In 2015, a documentary series called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, premiered on HBO. The filmmakers spent hundreds of hours interviewing Durst, his family, police, and lawyers. They dug deep into all three cases. The series was captivating, presenting old evidence in new ways and uncovering new clues. One of the most critical pieces of evidence they focused on was an anonymous letter sent to the police back in 2000, alerting them to a cadaver at Susan Berman's address. The handwriting was distinctive, and the word Beverly was misspelled as Beverly. For years, the author of this note was unknown. During the documentary, the filmmakers uncovered a letter that Durst had written to Susan Berman years earlier. The handwriting looked strikingly similar to the anonymous note, and on the envelope, Durst had made the exact same mistake, spelling Beverly as Beverly. It was a bombshell moment, a direct link between Durst and the scene of Susan Berman's murder. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. It happened in the final moments of the very last episode. After a tense interview where he was confronted with the handwriting evidence, Durst went to the bathroom, still wearing his microphone. Unaware he was still being recorded, he began muttering to himself, and the microphone picked up every chilling word. He whispered, "There it is. You're caught." He continued to ramble, his voice a low murmur, and then he said the words that would seal his fate. "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course. Killed them all, of course." It was a confession, a haunting, unguarded moment where the truth finally spilled out. The filmmakers, stunned by what they had captured, immediately turned the audio over to the authorities. The day before the finale of The Jinx aired, based on this new evidence, the FBI arrested Robert Durst in New Orleans for the murder of Susan Berman. His luck had finally run out. The final trial of Robert Durst began in Los Angeles. The prosecution's case was that Durst had killed Susan Berman because he feared she would tell the police what she knew about Kathy's disappearance. They argued that Susan had helped him cover up the first crime by pretending to be Kathy on the phone, calling in sick to her medical school the day after she vanished. But years later, with the case reopened, Durst allegedly killed his loyal friend to ensure her silence forever. This time, there was no escaping it. The evidence, including the handwriting and his own chilling confession, was overwhelming. In September 2021, after decades of suspicion, running, and legal battles, a jury found Robert Durst guilty of the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. He was finally held accountable for at least one of the deaths that had shadowed his life for so long. Just a few months after his conviction, in January 2022, Robert Durst died in prison at the age of 78. He was never tried for the disappearance and suspected murder of his wife, Kathy. That case officially remains unsolved. But with his deathbed confession and conviction for killing his best friend to cover it up, most people believe they finally know the truth. The story of Robert Durst is a chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous stories are the real ones, and that justice, even when delayed for decades, can eventually find its way. He was known as Pogo the Clown, a friendly face at children's parties and charity events. But behind the painted smile and colorful costume lurked one of America's most monstrous serial killers. This is the chilling true story of John Wayne Gacy. Born in Chicago in 1942, Gacy had a difficult childhood marked by an abusive, alcoholic father. As he grew into adulthood, he projected an image of a successful, community-minded man. He was a respected contractor, a precinct captain for the Democratic Party, and a beloved volunteer clown. He married twice and had children. On the surface, he was the picture of the American dream. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, a dark and horrifying secret was festering. The first whispers of something sinister began in the 1970s. Young men and teenage boys started disappearing in and around Chicago. Families were frantic, police were puzzled, but no one could connect the dots. The victims seemed to vanish without a trace. They were often runaways or young men working odd jobs, making them vulnerable and less likely to be immediately missed. Gacy, with his friendly demeanor and offer of construction work, was the perfect predator hiding in plain sight. He would lure his victims back to his home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. What happened inside those four walls was the stuff of nightmares. Gacy would subject his victims to unspeakable acts of torture before ultimately strangling them. His methods were brutal and systematic. He used a rope trick he'd learned, applying a tourniquet to control and ultimately end their lives. He showed no remorse, no empathy, only a chilling satisfaction in his power over them. But where did the bodies go? For years, this was the central mystery. Gacy's house held the gruesome answer. The crawl space, a dark, damp area beneath his home, became a massed grave. He buried victim after victim there, sometimes covering their bodies with lime and concrete to mask the smell. As he ran out of space, he became more brazen, burying some in his yard and even disposing of others in the nearby Des Plaines River. All the while, he continued his public life, clowning at parties, shaking hands with politicians, and living amongst neighbors who had no idea they were next to a graveyard. The break in the case came in December 1978. A 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest disappeared after telling his mother he was going to meet a contractor about a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Piest was last seen at the pharmacy where he worked, talking to Gacy. This time, the victim wasn't a drifter. He was a local boy from a good family, and his disappearance sparked an intense investigation. Police focused on Gacy. They put him under surveillance and obtained a warrant to search his house. The first search revealed suspicious items, including items belonging to other missing boys. But it was the smell that gave him away. A detective with a cold noticed a faint but persistent odor of decay. This led to a second, more thorough search. Police brought in a team with a specific, grim task: to excavate the crawl space. What they found was beyond comprehension. The discovery was a slow, agonizing process. One body, then another, then another. The crawl space yielded a horrifying tally of 26 victims. 3 more were found buried on his property, and another 4 had been thrown into the river. The total number of known victims reached 33. The suburban home that had once hosted neighborhood barbecues was now a national symbol of horror. The trial was a media sensation. Gacy's defense team argued that he was insane, that he had multiple personalities, and that one of these personalities, Jack, was responsible for the killings. Gacy himself was arrogant and unrepentant on the stand. He described his crimes in cold, detached detail, shocking the courtroom and the nation. He seemed to relish the attention, even drawing pictures of clowns and skulls from his jail cell. The jury, however, saw through the act. They rejected the insanity plea and found him guilty of 33 counts of murder. On March 13, 1980, he was sentenced to death. John Wayne Gacy spent 14 years on death row. He never expressed remorse for his actions. He maintained a bizarre sense of celebrity, corresponding with people and giving interviews where he would either deny his guilt or blame the victims. He famously told investigators, "A clown can get away with murder." On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words were a defiant and profane curse. The execution brought a close to one of the darkest chapters in American crime history. But for the families of the victims, the pain would never truly end. Many of the bodies were so badly decomposed that identification was a long and difficult process. For years, some victims remained nameless, their families left in a state of agonizing uncertainty. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, identifications have continued even in recent years, finally bringing a measure of closure to those who lost their loved ones decades ago. The story of John Wayne Gacy serves as a terrifying reminder that evil can wear the most ordinary, even friendly, of masks. He exploited trust, preyed on the vulnerable, and turned a symbol of childhood joy into an icon of fear. The image of the killer clown is now a permanent fixture in our cultural nightmares, forever linked to the man who lived a double life of community service and unimaginable evil. It's a story that forces us to look closer at the people around us and question what horrors might lie just beneath the surface. I'll tell you about Jeffrey Dahmer, to shock, but to show how quietly and slowly evil can take shape. This story doesn't begin with blood or screams. It begins with loneliness, overlooked warning signs, and people who chose to look away. Only later did the world see a monster. Before that, there was just a boy no one truly listened to. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At first glance, he didn't stand out. He was quiet, shy, physically frail. Inside his home, however, there was little stability. His mother struggled with serious mental health issues and an addiction to medication. While his father was emotionally distant, arguments were constant, and Jeffrey grew up surrounded by tension and emotional coldness. Even as a child, he seemed detached from his peers, as if watching the world from behind glass. Over time, behaviors appeared that today would be seen as alarming. He became fascinated with dead animals, collecting them, dissecting them, studying their bones. It wasn't driven by cruelty so much as obsessive curiosity. His father, a chemist, unaware of the danger, taught him basic chemistry and how to preserve bones. What looked like innocent curiosity to one person became the foundation of something far darker for Jeffrey. During adolescence, another layer of struggle emerged. Dahmer realized he was gay, which in the conservative atmosphere of the 1970s filled him with shame and fear. He didn't understand intimacy and couldn't form relationships. In his fantasies, control became central, total control over another person. Someone who wouldn't resist, wouldn't leave, wouldn't have a will of their own. Around the same time, he began drinking. Alcohol quickly stopped being optional and became essential. After high school, his life began to fall apart. His parents divorced, and his mother moved out, leaving Jeffrey alone in the house. It was then, in 1978, that the first murder occurred. Dahmer met a young hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks. They spent time together, drinking and listening to music. When Hicks wanted to leave, Jeffrey was overwhelmed by a panic-stricken fear of abandonment. He killed him. It wasn't an explosive act of rage, it was a decision rooted in terror. Afterward, he dismembered the body and disposed of the remains. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. In the years that followed, he tried to live a normal life. He joined the army, then enrolled in college. But everywhere he went, alcoholism and his deteriorating mental state followed. Eventually, he moved in with his grandmother, where for a time he did not kill. The fantasies, however, never disappeared. Instead of murder, there were druggings, sexual assaults on unconscious men, nights spent in bars. In 1988, he was arrested for molesting a minor. The system failed, he received a light sentence and was quickly released. The true escalation began when he moved alone into an apartment in Milwaukee, in the Oxford Apartments complex. There, Dahmer created his own private world of horror. He lured victims with promises of money, alcohol, or photo sessions. Most were young men, often from marginalized communities, often without anyone who would immediately look for them. He drugged them, strangled them, and then committed acts that remain horrifying even today. Necrophilia, cannibalism, keeping body parts, and crude experiments on the human brain. He dreamed of creating the perfect companion, someone alive, but completely stripped of free will. Neighbors complained about the smell. Police came and left. The most disturbing moment came when officers escorted a bleeding, naked teenager back into Dahmer's apartment, ignoring the desperate pleas of witnesses. That single decision cost another life. Everything ended in July 1991, when one victim managed to escape. Police returned with him to the apartment. What they found surpassed their worst expectations. Photographs of crimes, dismembered bodies, a refrigerator containing human organs, barrels filled with acid. Dahmer did not resist. He confessed, calmly, without emotion. He described 17 murders. The trial became a media spectacle. Psychiatrists examined him for hours, arguing over his sanity. In the end, he was declared legally sanely aware of what he had done. He was sentenced to life in prison. Families of the victims spoke of pain that would never fade. Society began asking difficult questions. How was it possible that no one stopped him sooner? In prison, Dahmer claimed to feel remorse. He spoke about faith, guilt, and deserving punishment. Some believed his repentance was sincere. Others saw yet another mask. In 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. His life ended, but the suffering he caused did not. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not only the story of a serial killer, it is a story of neglect, ignored warning signs, and repeated institutional failures. And it is a reminder that monsters rarely appear suddenly. More often, they are created slowly, in full view of a world that chooses not to look.